Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game Battle Report series. In this series we'll be covering Novacore, which ran this last week in Maitland, New South Wales, Australia. For those not familiar with the Australian tournament scene, Novacore is our largest annual event. It first ran in 2019 with almost 100 players, making it to date the largest event the Southern Hemisphere has ever seen, and a few years later we've been able to run it again. In these videos, I'll be covering basically my attendance to Novacore, the scenario mix, the lists that I chose, and then the 5 games. And as part of that, actually something I'd like to focus on is the tables that we played and just talking about how to think about, how to approach, and maybe how to build a table, if that's something of interest. But the first thing to think about is preparing for the event, and in particular, the mission lineup. The mission lineup for Novacore is on the screen now, and it was tough. It started with Countermeasures, then played Supplies, Supremacy, Rescue, and Comm Center from ITS Season 10. These are, by design, intensive missions. All of them require a considerable amount of attention and mission focus to play, and more than one of them requires, in some cases, quite specific list construction to be playable. Countermeasures is obviously the biggest example of that, but to an extent, Supplies, Rescue, and Comm Center all also want a degree of list focus. In preparing for this, I actually bounced back and forth between a few different factions that I was considering, but my overall concern was that these missions would encourage a significant hacking meta. You can kind of see it just in the missions themselves. Supremacy has a hacker bonus, Comm Center has a hacker bonus that is very important. And then Countermeasures in the current game edition and ITS season can kind of be limped through just off the strength of hacking, if nothing else, because telemetry is so easy to do with hackers these days and might even be done as part of a guided missile strike, for example. Hackers, and especially hackers that maybe are medium infantry or heavy infantry, can get you across the line in Countermeasures, if nothing else will. This broadly meant that my expectation was that going into Novacore, I would have to play into a really hacker-centric environment. So my primary intention for my lists was to be able to, at minimum, survive that, and ideally to dominate it. With this in mind, I thought about a few different factions, with Toha and Ariadne actually being kind of considerations as sidesteps to the hacking game. Ariadne obviously is not heavily hackable, neither is Toha. I could hopefully just deflect any points my opponent had spent on the hacking game, or say killer hackers, by taking those factions. But ultimately I decided that the reason I felt there was going to be a hacking game was because the missions really warranted it, and so by trying to play a faction that couldn't hack, I would have to really play out of my skin to have much of a chance in those missions. So with that in mind, and because they are an old friend and very dear to me, and because maybe I ranked them S tier in a recent video, I went with Combined Army. The first of the 2 lists that I took was this one that's on screen now, and people will probably recognize it from my CanCon videos. This is a slight further update to the list that I took to CanCon, but in essence this list is a very old friend. I've played this list in multiple events since N4 began. There are a lot of pieces in it that I really like, and it has always just performed well for me. It's deeply consistent, it has tons of very strong tools, it has redundancies and backups, and it hacks like an absolute champion. The change that I made in this scenario from the iteration that I took to CanCon is that the Motorized Bounty Hunter is back in, and since I had the SWC and fiddled with some points, it's got a Red Fury as well. This is a significant change from the CanCon version of this list, which did not have a Motorized Bounty Hunter. And the Bounty Hunter, I think, was needed. Firstly, I actually found that just having a second medium-range gun was quite nice in playtesting. This list often kind of relies on the Raicho, which is a single, very powerful weapon with long range, but if the Raicho goes down, you are forced to fall back on really scrapping and hacking attacks and melee and smoke and guided missiles. The Motorized Bounty Hunter gave me just one extra gun that could do things like occasionally roll up, for example, an MSV1 and go fight a bunch of flashball bots. The reason why I felt it was important to get the Motorized Bounty Hunter back in, though, is because Rescue was in this scenario mix. And in Combined Army, it is very easy to accidentally build a list that is very strong, but can't do Rescue. In rescue, you have to synchronize civilians, and you can't do that with impetuous troops or remotes. And impetuous troops and remotes are what you bulk out a combined army list with. Datarazis, T-drones, R-drones, Icadrons, Tega creatures, and obviously Imatrons because they can't move. None of those pieces can synchronize a civilian, meaning that if you don't have some fast elements that can cross the board, synchronize, and get back, you can be in trouble in that scenario. And I did not want to be relying purely on the Chironte, the Umbra, the Liberto, and the Raicha. And then obviously to an extent Bit and Kiss. So the Bounty Hunter is in there just to give me one more piece in rescue that I can potentially use. Now, there was not a specific plan to take this list into any individual mission. And in fact, I was kind of hoping that both of my lists would be playable in all 5 missions so that I could pick my list based on my opponent, the matchup, and the table. This list had a tag in it, so maybe my second list would not have a tag, something like that. This list would be more focused around offensive hacking that isn't Trinity because it has the Chironte, it has access to white noise, for example. Maybe my second list would not need that. But this is just a good solid core, and that I knew if I needed to, I could play this in basically any mission. The choice then was what to pair it with, and that actually took a lot more thinking about, and I ended up not making my decision until literally the night before the event. I'll show you first the first draft of what I was intending to take. So this on screen now is a list built for countermeasures plus other things as needed. And it is an avatar list. It's an avatar list with Bit and Kiss, an Umbra, and a Dartok for a lot of dangerous hacking, including some fairly powerful Trinity attacks. But then with a MedTech Obsidon Medcanoid, because I really like him in supplies. In supplies in particular, he's 6'4" movement. He and his slave drone can run up the board. He can pick up a box 2 dice on 17s. Then he can hand it over to the slave drone, or more accurately, the slave drone performs the action to pick it up. And then it runs back to my deployment zone, while the MedTech goes for a second supply box and then legs it back himself. In one turn, it can be very easy to very efficiently seize 2 supply boxes, which is nice. That's just really good in supplies. The list can also do countermeasures really well. It's only missing a couple of classifieds that it can't do. And in particular, the reason why this is a good supplies and countermeasures list is that those are really order-intensive scenarios, and the avatar gives you just a metric ton of orders. It is very easy to just get all of your classifieds done any turn that you can do them with this list, because the avatar is fueling that combat group just to pieces. It has so many orders to spend, you can easily do all of those order-intensive classifieds. I ended up not taking this list for a few reasons. The first reason is that I was not very practiced with it. And I wasn't very practiced with it because I don't actually really like playing an avatar. I find games with an avatar tend to be stressful for me and stressful for my opponent. Obviously, you can survive a game where the avatar dies. I often have. I've had games where the avatar has gone down in the first turn, and it's jumped its Memnonica into some other important piece, and I've carried the game on, and I've scrapped a fight out of the game. But it's still having so many of your resources dedicated in this single big piece means that you're playing kind of for high stakes. The face-to-face rolls feel more impactful and stressful and important. It's also, not to put too fine a point on it, really stressful to play an avatar against an avatar. It is the most mechanically powerful piece in the game. It is... I actually don't feel like I can make a comment on whether it is undercosted because it is very expensive, but it adds just so much ridiculous raw mechanical strength into a list that the act of playing against it is stressful and difficult. The damn thing is just really, really, really powerful. Frankly, probably too powerful. I do not think the avatar is actually particularly balanced, and I say that as someone who is playing Combined Army because I think they're one of the most powerful factions in the game. Because I don't like playing an avatar, and I don't like playing an avatar because it's stressful for people, including myself, I didn't have practice with an avatar. And because I didn't have practice with an avatar, I wasn't 100% sure that it would be the best thing to take to an event. Additionally, there's kind of a consideration of what scenarios you want to focus on in the mission lineup in terms of 1st through 5th. If your goal is to win, or at least do very well at an event, there's a strong argument that says you're probably going to be playing against players you are better than, at least in the first couple of rounds, and you will find your level quickly over the course of the event. The most challenging games will probably be in the final rounds. So by building a list, this list, right, which is like this will comfortably get me through countermeasures and supplies, I was front-loading the ability of my lists to play the event rather than rear-loading it in the scenarios where I would really need it. On top of that, there was also a very light concern about having a tag in both lists. I wasn't sure if the terrain would accommodate that. Turns out yes, but that was a concern. Ultimately, though, all of those factors kind of came second to the overriding reason why I didn't play this list, which was that for a lot of people, this was going to be their first event back in like 3 years, and for even more people, it would be their first event ever. And I hadn't seen tons of these people in ages. It was going to be primarily a social experience. There are lots of people I really wanted to see, and some of them I would see by playing a game against them. And I kind of just wasn't willing to be the guy who played the Avatar in that situation. I couldn't quite bring myself to do it. I will play grubby lists with missile launchers and prodigious hacking and Taiga creatures, but it turns out the line that I'm not quite willing to cross is taking an Avatar to someone's first event back in so long. So, with that said, what did I play instead? This list on the screen now is the list that I ended up eventually taking as my second list, and I'm actually really glad that I did, because I played it in all 5 rounds. It might have been a mistake in one of them, but we'll get to that. This list was designed to play even more heavily into the idea that Novacore was going to be a hacking matchup. In my original list, the comfortable one, the one with the Raicho, the one that kind of takes all comers, there are 2 hackers with access to Trinity and some good repeater networks, but there is not a real, like, hacking bully presence. There is not necessarily the ability to absolutely dominate the hacking game, and I wanted to try that. That's what the Anathematic is in there for. You'll note that it's not the Lieutenant, and I felt that was kind of important because the second thing this list is designed to do is, if I need to, it can survive not going first. My plan was to go first wherever possible, but that's always going to be down to the vagaries of the LT role. And there are certain factions, even if the scenario is like Supremacy, right, where if you win the role, maybe you will pick deployment in the hopes that you'll get second turn. In Supremacy, there are going to be some factions where I just could not guarantee that's what I would want to do. Maybe I would play against my friend Ed's Spiral Corps, who have counterintelligence and impersonators and etc. Maybe I'll play against Shazvastii, who have the same. Maybe I'll play against someone who just... there are so many factors where the scenario might want me to go second, but I might want to go first, and my opponent might want to go first. And I really wanted a plan for surviving if I didn't win the Lieutenant role and get the Alpha. Being able to hidden deploy the Anathematic, and then either just never reveal it because I'm going to need it in active turn, or reveal it to take a Plasma Rifle ARO as a reactive tool, was something I wanted to at least have access to. The Chironted MSV3 Lieutenant is therefore in the list because I want a Whip 16 Lieutenant to give me the best chance of winning the LT role as possible. And actually, it's not a piece that I've particularly played with. Neither is the Anathematic Hacker. I've dabbled with both of them, but I like the Chironted Hacker because it's cheaper than all of them. So I hadn't played with the MSV3 Chironted much at all, despite the fact that it's a very popular piece. And I have certainly lost some games to Ariadne, where I would really have liked to just discover, shoot, say, a tank under missile launcher to death. So it felt like a good fit alongside the Anathematic. I would still have Plasma in the list, but now I would also have an MSV3 Heavy Gunfighter. And then the rest of the list kind of just pads out with things that are very similar. Really, the big changes in this list are, rather than my Chironted Hacker and a Raicho, I have an Anathematic Hacker and a Chironted MSV3. It's 1 less order, sometimes it's 2 less orders because the Anathematic might be hidden. The Bounty Hunter only has a submachine gun, not a Red Fury, because I didn't have the points. Although by having the motorized Bounty Hunter not have a Red Fury, I do kind of like fake out 1.5 points of missing SWC. No one at any point seriously thought that I had anything other than an Anathematic in reserve. Yes, 1.5 is a Noctifer, but for real, there's just too many points off the table. And then it's Tagas, it's Datarazi, it's good combined army things, it's playing the top end and the bottom end really heavily. And because it's me, I still have an Unver Samaritan hacker, which will be very important in some games. Ultimately, for me, this list was a bit experimental. I had one game with it before I actually got to Novacore, but it performed well enough, and I would learn to play it over the course of 5 rounds. So happy that I put this together, happy that I came up with my last-minute list and I played it for many rounds, and this one is probably going in the stable. So let's see how it did. So round 1, as noted, was Countermeasures, and I would be playing against one of the Henry brothers, Luke Henry, playing StarCo. For those who don't know the Henry brothers, they are from Melbourne. They are wonderful people. I would play many Melbourneites in this event, and they were all wonderful people. StarCo were an interesting threat to have to face, and the reason for that is, again, you might remember my CanCon round 1 event where I had an anathematic and I got EM bombarded to hell by Emily. That was something that I was relatively scared about, and I was more scared about it because of the table. We'll show the table in a second, and I will actually have some critique of it, but suffice to say it was dense. Not just dense, actually, it was quite open in some places, but firing lanes were constricted. You'll see. That said, in the end, I did not have to worry about Emily. That's not what Peter was taking, Luke was taking, but his list was excellent, and here it is on screen now. Just as a note for these videos, there will be some more in this series. I have reconstructed my opponent's list as best I can, but the combat groups will not always be accurate. I'm pretty confident in the actual composition of models, but in some cases you might find, oh, that group lineup doesn't make sense. That's because I didn't know exactly what it was, or I can't remember. So he was playing a Fireteam core with 2 Alguacillos, one of which was the Lieutenant, a Daktari, Uhahu, and Nauf. I really like this as a fire team. It is not a pure core, it does not have composition bonuses, but Nauf does not need composition bonuses to absolutely slap. He serves as an ample fire base, and he will also give link bonuses to Uhahu, who benefits from them with her picture. You have a Daktari to at least have an attempt at picking up Nauf, or maybe pulling Uhahu out of no winning cap, and then just 2 Alguacillos. The decoy is important. It means that if you're not in a situation where you have only one viable lieutenant option. I like this as a core, and it's not expensive. Then had a Haris that I also really like, which was a Riot Girl Spitfire with 2 diggers with chain rifles. These would roll up an adhesive launcher +1 burst and mimetism -6, which was awesome. But this is just a cool, efficient gunfighting platform, and for not a lot of points. The diggers, when they can take cover and have like even higher burst on their weapons, is pretty neat. They are good close assault pieces. And the Riot Girl, obviously, if you just restrain her frenzy, is fantastic value. In Countermeasures, they're also all heavy infantry and have an MSV1. So that's a fantastic little team. Then there was Fiddler with 2 Jackbots. Awesome piece, very strong and fantastic in Countermeasures, and then a Trip Hammer as like the big heavy piece with an AP Spitfire and a heavy flamethrower. I would generally prefer, I think, the Burst 2 Chain Colt if I had any use for the spare point, and I think in this case I probably would have used the Burst 2 Chain Colt because there's a 10-point Jaguar, and I think an 11-point Jaguar is better, but ultimately it's much of a muchness, and the flamethrower did have some bearing on the game. It rolled up, I think, a light flamethrower, which is a shame, and Trip Hammers will do that sometimes, but the base chassis is fine. Rounding out the list, he had a Hawa Forward Observer, which again, very good piece in Countermeasures. Ideally, it would be a hacker, but there just isn't the SWC. And a Mandino, a Jaguar, a Salute, just Order Monkey, and a Transductor, just Order Monkey. These groups are almost certainly not lined up like this, but I like this. I think this list can fight at many ranges, with many tools. This is just a cool list. This is a good modern StarCo list. The only thing it doesn't have that I would love is Emily, or rather that I would fear is Emily. So let's have a look at the table. This is the table that we played in this game, and like I said, it is dense. And the reason that it is dense is that I set it up, but that's not the only reason. The reason is I set it up, or I was in the middle of setting it up the night before the event, when the person who owns the table, Ryan from Melbourne, of Brutal Cities, came and said, "Oh, thanks for setting up the table. It really needs to have that big white building on it. And that one you will see here." And so I want you to imagine the process of setting up a table that did not have that building on it, that just had all of these other really tall buildings, and then being told that you need to fit this absolute monstrosity onto the table. We had like 10 minutes to do that. We did not have time to do a complete rebuild. So on it went as best we could. The resulting table is almost claustrophobic in terms of the ground level play. And actually, this is where I would like to critique this as a table. For those who like and are interested in Brutal Cities terrain, you can find that online at brutalcities.com, I think, but just Google Brutal Cities. They are fantastic, infinity-appropriate brutalist architecture style buildings. But, and this is the feedback I gave to Ryan, Ryan loves making terrain pieces that are like centerpieces, that are large and impressive and tall, like 3- and 4-story buildings. And an infinity table does not function well when it is constructed entirely of centerpieces. This table was a problem to play on, and the reason it was a problem is that all of these buildings are 3 stories tall. They were about 9 inches tall apiece, which means that, among other things, zone of control wouldn't reach the ground necessarily, which is not inherently a problem, but the sheer act of playing this table was an issue. This table, to be frank, was an accessibility nightmare. If I had, or if anyone who played on this table had mobility issues, or was just, like, I'm not tall, I'm 5'10" and change. If I'd been any shorter, physically, like, seeing anything on this table would be a challenge. I would probably have required a stool. Getting miniatures on the ground level, which was safest to actually move, meant reaching your hands down into these spaces and then trying to make measurements or movements, etc. It was a mess. The table itself, the aesthetic was fantastic. It had this whole like Chernobyl vibe of a ruin being overtaken by the wilderness. It was magnificent to look at, but it needs to be shorter. It needs to not be as tall. There's really no point to having buildings that are that tall in any case. The tallest model in Infinity is a tag. And if your buildings are twice the height of a tag, then everything on ground level has meaningful total cover. Adding another whole story on top doesn't actually improve playability at all. It's only an aesthetic choice, and it's an aesthetic choice that comes at the cost of accessibility to the table. In terms of how we played this, so you'll see the rooftop is quite open. That was by design, and I think actually is a nice way of adding a level to the table. These big gantries here were a godsend, just in terms of playability. I mean, you could access the rooftops from like lots of different parts of the table. The buildings with blown out interiors were all accessible. We had an elevator inside each one, which you could use by using a short move skill. And this was critical, the buildings were played as see into or out of, but not through. This was the standing rule for the event. But in this case, it was also, and you might see this on here, a very helpful piece of paper laminated was put down next to the table. It says line of sight into buildings but not through. This is a really good thing to do, by the by. If you are taking a table to an event and you have some house rules that make it playable, do like laminate this stuff or put it on a piece of paper and have it with the table. It meant that we could look at this piece of paper and go, oh yeah, that's how we're supposed to play it. That makes total sense. So that was awesome. Really good thing to do. Wasn't there on the table at the event that did that. So overall, I rate this table an accessibility issue out of 10, but it did look absolutely fantastic. So how did the game play? First things first, I won the lieutenant role and went first. This would be a theme throughout the entire event. There was no lieutenant role that I failed, and there was no scenario that I did not choose to go first on. That's kind of down to how either, 1, my list is designed to play, or 2, I am too afraid to give my opponent first turn. You'll see that in some future games. In countermeasures, without knowing if Emily was on the way, I was not prepared to have my lieutenant EM bombed on the first round and just deny myself a first turn. And also, frankly, countermeasures is a scenario where you can kind of just go first. The advantage to going second in countermeasures is that it is much, much safer to clump your HVTs and then protect them all. You can't really do that if you're going first, because you'll place them all and then your opponent will know where all of your HVTs are and be able to deploy their entire army accordingly. Whereas if you're going second, you can maybe sometimes clump your HVTs because your opponent will have to have been spread out. For my deployment, I am mostly hunkered into and around buildings. There are a few pieces here and there. I actually rolled up a HMG on the SMG Bounty Hunter, which would be very relevant. But because there are like big shadows behind these buildings, the impetuous troops are all just lined up to make runs, to move forward. as aggressively as possible. The turret is hanging out down here on the ground floor, just at close range. The Libertos is sort of here, ready to move out. And my anathematic is hanging out basically in ground floor here, hidden. Having the anathematic in hidden deployment actually would prove to be really nice in a lot of missions, because it would mean I could reserve my Charonted HMG and really not give my opponent much information. It wasn't as good as like Strategos would be, but it was very close. The last thing to note about my deployment is that the Umbra Samaritan would go down here, and that was with the intention of either super jumping over to this building or moving this direction and super jumping onto this walkway to get access to other parts of the high ground. For his part, you can't quite see it here, but there is a very nice sheltered L-shaped bombed out building over here that the StarCo Link team would go in. The Trip Hammer would come down here, kind of looking with its flamethrower into this building, and the Riot Girl Harris would come down here. Everything else was just kind of smattered and scattered about, and each of us would have basically our HVTs spread out across the entire table. So you can see mine, there, and then there would be one over here. Very wide spread of HVTs with maximum distance between them. This is a totally serviceable way to play countermeasures if you don't want to clump, and I think, like I said, it's better if you're going first. And I think on the StarCo side of the table, there wasn't really any location where you could safely just put all three of them. Here is a really quick shot just to emphasize what I mean by the height of these buildings. I was trying to take high elevation shots for most of these pictures that will be in these battle reports, but again, just kind of imagine having to reach your arm down there. I think the ideal setup for this table would be if most of these buildings were 2 stories tall, and maybe the ones in the center were 3 stories tall. That would mean each player would have good visibility down into their part of the table and could work with their opponent who would have visibility to their side, and just the accessibility issue becomes much, much easier to manage. I won't have many photos of my opponent's armies in most other games, but because it looked really cool, just here's a quick shot of Luke's deployment zone. And here is the Trip Hammer, and now this is what I mean by this building here. Uhahu is nestled down quite comfortably on the 2nd level. The Daktari is prone, and then Nauf. Nauf has a very nice line, sort of like across my bows, as it were. He can pinch off sort of about half of the table, but this is literally the only cross map fire lane that there is, and I will spend most of the game avoiding it. So this shot here will show you basically how the action went down on my first turn. This was actually a really tricky one. Usually how I would want to approach a mission like this is just in the absence of any objectives, is I use Bit and Kiss to get some repeaters forward. Those repeaters will basically lock my opponent down, allow me to launch hacking attacks. Ideally, I'm looking to establish hacking superiority, and you'll see this in the 2nd round game. But basically not overexpose myself and set my defenses up and do some damage. Maybe launch a missile strike, maybe some Trinity kills. But in countermeasures, that wasn't really viable. And on this map, I just couldn't, the movement it would have taken to get Bit and Kiss out of where they were, which is in this building over here. And they would have had to have come all the way around here, up around this way, to maybe fire some pitches into this building, which would have been fine, but the only classifier that I can do from the 1st round drop in any case was data scan an enemy troop, which doesn't work through pitches. So after a good couple of minutes thinking about it, I just bust the anathematic out of hidden deployment and he made a run. So pretty much the entirety of my first turn is, oh, you can see the Toronto HMG here, by the way. The entirety of my first turn is the anathematic making this straight line run here, bunking into the blizzard zone, and then coming around here. And along the way, what he does is, firstly, he data scans the enemy Trip Hammer, then he spotlights it, then I kill it with missiles. I'm normally not super down for missile kills on tags, because most of them will have ECM, and it's fine. 12s is fine, but in this case, Trip Hammer has no ECM, so I lit it up and dropped it with missiles, and then I rounded the corner. And in particular, I think I sort of hung around here for most of this, and the engagement that took place here was a hacking duel, where the anathematic basically fought Uhahu over here, and after 2 face-to-face rolls with its burst 4 whip 16 Trinity, no repeaters, no firewalls, he put her down and out for the count. This could have gone quite badly for me if she, for example, had crit with Oblivion. I would have left it there and it would have been trying to reset an active turn, but I'd gotten the one classified I could do, and it would be a pain in the ass standing there no matter what else happened. As it was, kind of unsurprisingly, 4 dice 19s beat 1 dice 14, and he took Uhahu down. I had a couple of orders left at this point, not enough to accomplish anything super meaningful, except there were the 2 Alguacillos. One of them was nooked just in behind this wall and like basically totally invulnerable to everything, and the other one was hidden by distance. I only really had one shot at spotlighting and trying to missile kill another piece. It could have been the Dactari, but I went for this Alguacil. Got it on the first go, and then the Anathematic kind of like hang out where it was, and I used my last order to land a missile down on this poor Alguacillo, which, as it would turn out, was my opponent's lieutenant. Now, I think the recovery that my StarCo opponent had this game was actually fantastic. He did a really good job of fighting through loss of lieutenant. It took most of his command tokens, but basically what happened is he broke the link teams with impetuous troops, with the diggers, and they just yeeted forward. They moved up to take positions, they used those impetuous orders, and he spent the majority of his command tokens having the Riot Girl then move up to around here and do follow-up, or the whichever the MSV one is, follow-up, I think. On one of my, I had a HVT over here, so that got consumed. This is like, okay, cool, well, you did one classified, but classifieds are how you win this game. Didn't really kill anything, but didn't lose anything either. Obviously, a turn in loss of lieutenant is fantastic for me. I didn't take any really significant casualties, but by the same token, my opponent was still able to push the mission, equalize the score, and that is good. That is good to be able to do in a loss of lieutenant situation. That is exactly how you should handle that kind of thing. Don't expose yourself to significant danger. Set your defenses forward. He used a combination of irregular and impetuous movements to do that really nicely. The diggers move up as ablative pieces. All in all, very well done. Second turn, the flop comes down, and I have 1 or 2 classifieds I think I can do this turn. The most significant one is that it's HVT, heavy infantry, the HVT. And I think that might be the only one I get done this turn as well. It's not like the risk that I have run with this list is that it is good at doing some classifieds, but not all of them. I have to wait for my opening to get classifieds done, and I really don't get that opening on the second turn either. That said, I still have plenty of orders and have basically lost nothing. So the plan gets made, and the plan is that the Chirontid HMG disembarks its position here, comes down the elevator, moves up to here and around to here under Datarazi smoke, and there is basically a long and savage gunfight against diggers, and the Riot Girl. And after many orders, he puts all of them down, except for the digger that has rolled up, ironically, mimetism. No, the digger that has rolled up adhesive launcher. It just survives everything, and I just give up trying to kill it because I have other things that I need to do. What I'm looking to do this turn, apart from like pin my opponent down, is I want to move the biker up this way, and I am trying to in extremis recovery an enemy. And I'm going to try this down to the last order. So first thing that happens actually in terms of accomplishing that, so that the HVT over here and my Chirontid lieutenant on the way past just goes, cool, tag, you're it, that's one classified. And that's right, in extremis recovery tries to get done this turn. A Taker creature does it first, where he just runs around this way, dodges into line of fire, moves up, and he tries to in extremis recovery the unconscious Riot Girl that Chirontid has put down. He needs a 15 and he fails. That's fine, it happens. He gets shot by a turret and by one of Fiddler's jackpots and by Fiddler, who is in the building up here. So, alright, I've got a HMG Bounty Hunter. It drives up as well. Now, I'm not willing to throw it away quite as much, and I have some orders spare. So what I do with the biker is that I first engage and destroy the turret, then I engage and destroy a jackpot, then I engage and I kill Fiddler. That's really good. Not only is she one of the most dangerous pieces left on my opponent's side of the board, but also she's a massive specialist. That gives me one chance to move in an in extremis recovery the Riot Girl, need a 16, and I fail. So that sucks. So I only get one classified done this turn, but I had a chance at 2. It is what it is. However, I have still done a lot of damage to my opponent. They are bleeding models at this point. They draw up basically only one countermeasures classified I think they can do, which is to forward observe a HVT. And so we sort of workshop this out ourselves. where there's a camo token up here that stands up, and it moves along here. It gets discovered by the Chirontid. It ducks down to cover safety, recamouflage, moves back around here, moves over to here. I spotlight it through a repeater when it reveals, which does not get me a classified, unfortunately, and it forward observes in one go this HVT here, which gets the forward observe the HVT classified done. The last time that, it takes 2 orders, and on the second or the last of those 2 orders, I actually elect not to shoot with my turret. And the reason is that in the flop is Predator. And I want to get that kill with Predator. So I begin my 3rd turn, and finally I have a whole bunch of classifieds that I can do. Predator is there, not Spotlight, but Hack the HVT is there, and Veteran Escort the HVT is there as well, which means that this turn 3 is the Umbra Samaritan's time to shine. He stands up, he legs it along this way, he super jumps the gap, dodges a shotgun template, moves into melee, gets crit by a shotgun, but passes one of his 2 saves, enters no wounding cap, activates again, scores the kill, goes back up to a nice comfortable 1+1 health. Comes around this way, pops down the stairwell, and spends like 4 orders trying to successfully hack the HVT and failing all of them on whip 14. But as he's doing so, he walks this way, he synchronizes this civilian, that'll get me the veteran one, then he walks back this way, and on the last order, he hacks this HVT over here, putting me on 5 classifieds done. We flip back over to my opponent's turn, and there's not a lot left. I think, in fact, he might be in retreat. Nalf has some inconsequential gunfights with the Anathematic that accomplishes nothing, and he derives a plan. We actually worked this out together. He derives a plan in his last turn to maybe be able to enact rescue. And so this baggage bot that's been hiding out back here the entire game, it has to come around this way, move, dodge the HMG Armed Bounty Hunter, dodge the Anathematic, move again, dodge, move, pick up a wounded Ermendino, and then survive. And glory be, the little bastard actually does all of those things. I either whiff with the HMG, or it makes its dodge, or it makes its armor roll. It gets to the wounded Ermendino, picks it up, and that's the last thing. That's the last order that can be spent. So that puts Luke on 3, I believe, classifieds to my 5, which in Countermeasures is a 3-7 win. So that was the first round. It was very scrappy. It was kind of me learning how to play this list on a very weird table. And in fact, on the table overnight, the tournament organizers would come back to it and do a full reset up. And it would actually look very similar to this, but all of these buildings would be slanted diagonally instead, kind of like that, which limited a little bit of the rooftop movement, but just opened up some breathability in terms of the fire lanes and human line of sight onto the table, which was a really good change. I'm not sure if it was Grady or Nick Hamanet who made that change, but whoever it was, you did really good work. The second version of this table, it looked much more physically playable and also just sort of like suitable to the game. So that was round 1. Off we went to lunch, and you'll see round 2 in a video coming up soon.